The salt air in Port Morning never felt like a greeting to Thomas. It felt like a stinging, persistent reminder of everything he had buried beneath the waves. Once, he had been the gold standard of high-stakes maritime navigators, a man who could read the stars like an open map and navigate treacherous waters. But that was before the tragedy, the night the sea claimed his certainty and shattered his internal horizon. That failure hadn't just cost him his career, it had cost him the respect of his brother, a rift that now felt as wide and cold as the Atlantic itself. Now Thomas moved through the cobbled streets like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. His confidence was a sunken wreck, and the silence from his family was a weight heavier than any anchor. He spent his days in the grey shadows of the docks, a man without a heading, feeling abandoned by fate and directionless. The fog had a way of swallowing the world in Port Morning, seeping through the cracks of his cottage and into Thomas's soul. On this particular afternoon, he sat in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of a legacy he no longer felt he deserved. Among the rusted sextants and yellowed charts, he pulled out his late grandfather's old nautical logbook. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume that smelled of brine and wisdom. As he thumbed through the brittle pages, a weathered, worn piece of parchment slipped out and fluttered to the floor. It was a handwritten prayer. The ink faded into a ghostly brown, addressed to St. Andrew. Thomas stared at the words, his calloused fingers tracing the parchment. St. Andrew, the first called, the humble fisherman who had dropped his nets on the shores of Galilee without a second thought to follow a voice that promised a greater purpose. The legend spoke of a man who possessed the courage to leave the known safety of the shore for the terrifying unknown, guided by a faith that transcended physical maps. In the maritime lore his grandfather had cherished, Andrew was the patron of those who sought a new path when all the old ways were blocked by the storms of life. He was the one who showed that being lost was often the first step toward being found. That night, the sky turned a bruised purple, signaling an atmospheric shift. Thomas lay awake in the dark, the prayer resting on his bedside table like a silent accusation. He tried to mock the idea of divine guidance. Where had such grace been when the waves had torn his life apart? He told himself that a navigator relied on steel and mathematics, not ancient pleas to a fisherman's saint. Yet, as the wind began to howl against his shutters and the house groaned, the words of the prayer haunted his core. They spoke of finding light in the darkest gale and discovering a shore where none seemed to exist. His mind was a tempest of regret and cynicism, a sleepless cycle that offered no safe harbor for his spirit. The dawn brought no peace, only a frantic knocking at his door. It was an old friend, a fellow sailor whose face was etched with raw desperation. A vessel had gone missing in the treacherous outer reaches, and with a hurricane spiraling toward the coast, no captain was willing to risk the crossing. "You're the only one who knows those currents in the dark, Thomas," his friend pleaded. "If anyone can find them before the eye hits, it's you. They're out there, waiting for a ghost to save them." Thomas stood on the edge of the pier, the wind whipping his coat as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the churning water. In one hand, he gripped his old brass compass, its needle spinning erratically. In the other, he held the prayer to St. Andrew, the paper damp with sea spray. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The horizon flared with a sudden strike of white lightning, illuminating the impossible choice before him. He could stay in the safety of his misery, or he could answer the call and step into the heart of the storm to see if the old words held the power to lead him home. Thomas stepped onto the deck of the Aegis, the search vessel's engines vibrating through the soles of his boots like a restless mechanical heartbeat. The transition from the solid pier to the shifting, unpredictable sea felt like crossing a threshold between two worlds. As the lines were cast off and Port Morning faded into a blur of grey mist and salt spray, he reached into his pocket and felt the crinkle of his grandfather's prayer. He didn't start the engines for the promise of a reward or the restoration of his reputation. He did it because the silence of his life had become louder than any storm. As the first massive swell lifted the bow and dropped it with a bone-jarring thud, Thomas began to recite the words under his breath. "O Saint Andrew, who followed the light when the world was dark, steady my hand upon this wheel." The ocean was no longer a place of commerce or travel. It had become a psychological battlefield. Every wave that crashed over the bow seemed to carry the echoes of his past mistakes. He saw the faces of those he had failed, the cold eyes of the Board of Inquiry, and most vividly, the disappointed silhouette of his brother. It was then that the true weight of the mission settled in his marrow. This wasn't an anonymous rescue. The message his friend had delivered in secret burned in his mind. His brother was the lead engineer on the missing vessel. The rift between them, carved by years of silence and blame, now hung over the water like a guillotine. If his brother drowned in this hurricane, Thomas knew he would never truly breathe again. This was his final attempt at redemption, a desperate quest to save the one person who anchored him to his humanity. As the storm intensified into a screaming wall of wind, Thomas felt a strange shift in his perception. The prayer wasn't just a set of religious verses, it was becoming a roadmap for his soul. He began to see signs that defied the logic of a navigator. A sudden, brief break in the obsidian clouds revealed a single, flickering star, an impossibility in the heart of a hurricane. Moments later, a storm petrel, a bird known to sailors as a harbinger of hope, banked against the gale, its wings nearly touching the churning whitecaps as it flew true toward the northeast. Thomas felt a tug in his chest, an intuition that mirrored the unwavering faith Andrew had shown when he left his nets on the shore. He turned the wheel, following the bird and the star, ignoring the cold logic of his malfunctioning instruments. Then, disaster struck the bridge. The navigation systems flickered, hissed with the scent of ozone, and went completely dark. The GPS died, and the digital charts vanished into a void of black glass. The crew erupted in a chorus of panic. "We're blind, Thomas. We're sailing into a grave." The mutinous crew member, a man whose fear had curdled into aggression, stepped forward with a heavy wrench in his hand. He lunged for the manual throttle, his eyes wild with the primal need to survive. "We're turning back. I won't die for a fool's errand." Thomas didn't move. He stood his ground with a renewed moral authority that seemed to silence the wind itself. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice steady and sharp. "The maps are gone, but the path is still there. We are the only light those men have left." His faith, bolstered by the ancient words, acted as a shield. The crew member hesitated, the wrench trembling in his hand, before finally lowering it, cowed by a strength he couldn't understand. Just as Thomas regained control of the Aegis, the fog parted for a split second. There, caught in the terrifying, spiraling rotation of the Devil's Throat, a deadly whirlpool where the currents turned into a hungry, white-foamed abyss, lay the shattered, half-submerged wreckage of the missing boat. It was a vision of ruin, and among the debris, Thomas knew his brother was fighting for life. The Devil's Throat was a screaming, spinning maw of salt and terror. The Aegis groaned as the outer currents of the whirlpool grabbed the hull, pulling the search vessel toward the center where the missing boat was being shredded like wet paper. Thomas gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on a single, flickering strobe light in the chaos. He knew that any traditional approach would lead to their certain destruction. The crew held their breath, some praying, others weeping, as they watched the abyss yawn wide. But Thomas was no longer navigating by the laws of man or the logic of steel. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, the final lines of the prayer to St. Andrew echoing in his mind. He wasn't just a navigator anymore. He was a man following a higher calling. "O apostle of the deep, who saw the Master on the shore," he whispered, "give me the strength to be a fisher of men this night. Let my hands be yours, and my eyes see the path you have clearly laid before me." In a move that defied every naval textbook, Thomas didn't fight the pull of the whirlpool. Instead, he accelerated, steering the Aegis into the very curve of the spiral, using the centrifugal force to slingshot the vessel across the churning lip of the vortex. The ship tilted at an impossible angle, but as they reached the apex, Thomas saw him. His brother was clinging to a piece of wreckage, his face a mask of exhaustion. The sight of his kin sparked a fire in Thomas that no ocean could extinguish. "Heave the lines!" Thomas roared, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no hesitation. As the Aegis skidded past the wreckage, Thomas himself lunged for the railing. With a strength born of spiritual desperation, he caught his brother's hand just as the debris was swallowed by the dark water. The weight was immense, the cold of the Atlantic biting deep into his joints, but he refused to let go. With the help of the crew, he pulled his brother over the gunwale. The two men collapsed onto the wet deck. There were no words at first, only the sound of ragged breathing. Then, as his brother looked up and recognized the face of the man who had saved him, the years of resentment evaporated. They embraced, the salt spray washing away the bitter memories of the past. The brother wept against Thomas's shoulder, a silent admission of forgiveness that no formal apology could have ever achieved. Their bond, once broken by the sea, was now forged in its fire. As if on command, the moment the prayer's final "Amen" left Thomas's lips, the hurricane seemed to lose its malice. The wind died down to a rhythmic hum, and the churning clouds parted. A path of silver moonlight spilled across the water, illuminating a calm, steady road back toward the horizon. It was now a silver road that guided the Aegis away from the devil's throat. The ocean was now a mirror, reflecting the profound peace in Thomas's soul. Returning to port morning, Thomas was a man reborn. He didn't return to the world of commercial shipping. Instead, he used his savings to open a small school for young navigators. He taught them about tides and stars, but more importantly, he taught them about the inner compass. He hung the framed prayer to St. Andrew in the main hall, a constant reminder that being caught in the nets of life was never the end, but a new beginning. As Thomas looked at the horizon one last time, he didn't see a place of fear. He saw a vast expanse of infinite possibility, knowing that as long as he sought guidance, he would never truly be lost again. The sea was no longer his enemy, but his teacher. The salt air felt like a divine blessing, and his heart was at long last finally at rest.